but I wanted to give enough of a feel for the variety of
Mhm.
interpretation because often ancient interpretation is either cast as very sort of unenlightened and fanciful and of no use to us, or we get the opposite extreme where suddenly we just need to adopt all of these approaches as our own. So I think being able to see that these early interpretations are of many different
Mm.
varieties
Mm.
is going to be helpful to readers. They have to be critical when they read them, but they can also be open to places where these ancient interpreters can be very helpful to us.
Everyone, welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Michael Shepherd. He's professor of biblical studies at Cedarville University, and we're going to be discussing his new book, How Did They Read the Prophets? Early Jewish and Christian Interpretations. I've got it right here. A fantastic new book. Dr. Shepherd is actually another returning guest on the podcast. So if you're interested in his story, how he got into academia, that kind of stuff, you can check out our prior episode after this. I'll link it in the description. It's based on another one of his books, which was really good as well. Super excited to discuss this book. It's a study of how Old Testament writers are interpreting and reading one another, as well as how other early Jewish and Christian writers are interpreting those. So if that's of interest to you, kind of early biblical interpretation, this is a fantastic introduction. As I'm trying to show the book, because you can see it's actually pretty short, so it's very accessible. Lot of really great examples of what this early biblical interpretation looks like, as well as Dr. Shepard's discussion of some of the implications of that. So I highly commend this book. Really great study it'd be a great, I think, book discussion kind of thing, or even maybe a textbook for students if you have a class on that's incorporating elements of early biblical interpretation. A lot of good stuff here. We get into just a few examples from the book in the interview, so you can get a flavor for it. But there's a lot of really awesome stuff that he gets into that we just didn't have time to cover. If you're new to watching us on YouTube or new to listening to us on podcasts, please do make sure to like and subscribe, leaving comments. All of that helps us in the algorithms and makes our content spread. If you want to share our stuff with your circles, that's awesome as well. We're just trying to put out good content that's enjoyable to people and informative, edifying. And we're going to continue to do this work. So we appreciate any way you can help support us in that. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into our interview with Dr. Shepherd. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the podcast. Delighted to be rejoined by Dr. Michael Shepherd. This is the second time we've had you on, Dr. Shepherd. We're excited to talk about your new book, How Did They Read the Prophets? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a delight, and I enjoyed the first book we discussed very much. People can check out that interview, and if they want to hear a little bit more about your story and journey into academia, they can do that. But I really like this book a lot, and it hit home with kind of some of my own research interests. So I'm really excited to dive in.
Okay.
Yeah, so could you just begin maybe by sharing a little bit about kind of the overall project, what you're hoping to accomplish with this book? It's kind of a combination of what's sometimes called interbiblical exegesis and early interpretation of text. And so
Right.
what's the goal for the book?
Well, it was really, I talk a little bit about the inspiration of James Kugel
Mm-hmm.
right away in the introduction, who's obviously very well known for his work in this area. And in going back and reading some of his work, I just enjoyed the process of reading through texts with these ancient interpreters. And I thought, it'd be nice to kind of reproduce that experience for readers of the prophets in particular.
Mm.
And I wanted to start, as early as possible with the biblical authors themselves interpreting one another. And that brought in things like the transmission of the text in various witnesses, early translation of the text, and of course, some of our earliest commentary. And I really wanted to focus on early readers of the Hebrew texts. So I noticed there's already a review out of the book wondering why I didn't talk about the early church fathers.
Mm.
And I thought I made it clear in the book, but I really wanted to focus on those who were looking at the Hebrew texts and not later translations. So the idea was to give a kind of selective but also representative example of readings across the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. It's not exhaustive. These are not all of the interpretations of the prophets in antiquity, and we're certainly not touching on every single text in the prophets. But I wanted to give enough of a feel for the variety of interpretation, because often ancient interpretation is either cast as very sort of unenlightened and fanciful and of no use to us, or we get the opposite extreme where suddenly we just need to adopt all of these approaches as our own. So I think being able to see that these early interpretations are of many different varieties is going to be helpful to readers. They have to be critical when they read them, but they can also be open to places where these ancient interpreters can be very helpful to us.
Yeah, no, that's great. Recognizing that as there is variation in the text itself that's being interpreted at this time, there's basically different ways you can go when you're interpreting certain passages, and you do a nice job of laying that out and giving us some of the implications for that as well. I wanted to read a quote from page 5 because I think this is a really helpful quote, and maybe it can be a springboard for further conversation. I think this is a really important point you want to make in the overall project about interpretation not being something that's secondary to the project of the Bible, but that the Bible itself is an interpretive project. You write this: if the earliest biblical interpreters are the biblical authors themselves, then their interpretations must be considered original rather than transformative. There is no extant interpretation that precedes their work. And I think one of the things I sensed is that you're trying to push back against a little bit. And this is a little bit of insider baseball for those that maybe aren't like in the field, right? But there are different points of emphases that scholars have. And you could argue that a lot of the modern historical critical project has been more interested in, quote unquote, the world behind the text, hypothetical reconstruction of the life of these prophets and or their sources. Like, so when you think about study of the Hebrew Bible, a lot of it is study of the sources of the Hebrew Bible rather than the text itself. And you're wanting to argue that, like, but we need to take very seriously that these texts only come to us through these acts of interpretation. That's the form in which we have them, and that should kind of be our starting point for thinking about the interpretive process. So it's not like text, then interpretation. It's text through interpretation that informs the process. So I want to know if you want to say anything more about that.
Yes, I think it's a very good point that you're making. The Bible itself is the product of interpretation. So when we think of the Bible, it needs to be interpreted, and that's true. But also interpretation is generating the Bible itself. So that's how it comes to be, is this process of interpreting and interpreting. So the idea that somehow the earliest interpreters were all transforming the Bible, and that the Bible was received as this sort of malleable thing, and that interpretation was always a change of what was there. This kind of opens the door for the modern historical critic to say, okay, well, they were changing it early on, so we can go back and sort of restore what was there originally. And my point is that if our earliest interpretations are within the Bible itself, where is the transformation taking place that we need to get back behind and restore something else? And the point is not that all early interpretation, again, is of the same kind. There are obviously things going on that take the Bible in very different directions from what the authors themselves had in view. But I'm just trying to leave room for the other as well, that there are interpretations going on that are actually consistent with what the biblical authors wanted to communicate. And these are things that we can learn from and value even today. I think, when I was mentioning earlier the way we sometimes caricature this early stage of interpretation, in many ways, it's no different from any other stage in the history of interpretation,
Hmm.
in the sense that there are advantages, there are disadvantages, there are pitfalls that we have to be aware of, but also things that we should continue to value.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. Um, I wanted to ask you too about, because I know I kind of was trying to read between the lines a little bit on some of what you say in the book, but I think it's an interesting question, and I know scholars diverge widely on this question. It has to do with the question of canon, and when you're thinking about early interpretation, a lot of the text you're looking at are obviously it's pre-formation of canon. Um, do you, when you're looking at text, like you have a section where you discuss texts that are early interpretations of Bible, and then you list off like apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, other texts, other corpora like that, some of which go back to antiquity, others of which are just like modern inventions, like we have all these disparate texts, let's call them all pseudepigrapha, right? But I guess, how do you distinguish between those, right, in a pre-canonical era? Um, do you draw hard lines between texts that, or is there, do you point to evidence in this period even where you would say, I think we can show that some of these texts are more quote unquote canonical in the way that they're being used than others? Or how do you approach that question?
Yeah, so I don't get into a discussion of canon per se in the book. There is, in the final chapter, a section on formation of a prophetic corpus as part of a larger canonical structure, and that there's already some awareness of this going on, the formation of Moses and the prophets, so to speak. Um, I see that process as a very organic one. So
Mm-hmm.
when I look at these texts and thinking of them as canonical, I'm not so much thinking of a list of books that has been declared authoritatively somewhere, but rather what do I see within these books in terms of them being shaped in light of one another.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that process going on very heavily within the books we typically think of as the canonical prophets.
Yeah.
When I turn to something like apocrypha, pseudepigraphal literature, or some of the commentaries on the prophets from the Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth, these are taking a different posture toward these texts. They don't see themselves as part of this same organic growth, but rather reacting to something that already exists.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of exegetical relationship, very similar to the relationship of the New Testament writings to these texts.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a whole separate question. How does that get brought in as the Christian canon? But I do see those writings in the New Testament as relating to something that they have already received,
Yeah.
as scriptural and authoritative, as opposed to, oh, we're still part of this same process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful clarification. Let's get into some of the specifics then. You've got chapters on Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the so-called major prophets, and then one on the Book of the 12. Um, we'll start with Isaiah, obviously super important text. Can you
Yes.
just talk to us a little bit about how Isaiah already is presenting itself in kind of connection with the Mosaic tradition, and picking up on that same theme that we kind of get at the end of Deuteronomy, where Moses is crying out against the people and witnessing?
Yes. So I think this is something, an interesting feature both at the beginning of Isaiah and the beginning of Jeremiah, this kind of effort to present the prophet in continuity with Moses and, in effect, as a legitimate prophet like Moses that the reader can trust. So it's been widely recognized that the opening chapter of Isaiah is really echoing material from the Song of Moses there
Mm-hmm.
in Deuteronomy 32, which really was a song that was designed to be an ongoing witness
Mm-hmm.
against the people demonstrating God's fidelity and the people's lack thereof. So this whole idea of calling on creation to bear witness to this case that he has against his people, that his people are like rebellious children or an animal that doesn't know its owner. So all of these lines seem to be very deliberately taken from that psalm to kind of usher the reader in to the type of prophecy that the book will present.
Mhm.
And the example that I give in that opening chapter of the book is how the Targum tradition picks this up. And in particular, the Palestinian tradition of rendering Deuteronomy 32. It actually sees this close connection to Isaiah 1 and kind of works that in to its very expansive rendering of that text. So it kind of brings the reader in and forces the reader to think about, there is this close relationship between the two, and the wording is very precise, and it talks about, why is it in this particular order and so forth. So it's a very nuanced way of doing it. It's not a commentary form in that particular tradition, in the sense that it's not saying, here's Isaiah and he's Moses, and it's not expository in that sense, but it just sort of brings the two together and forces the reader to think about why would they be brought to you.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. For those that maybe aren't aware too, Targum, you want to just real quick on that? What are
Yes.
what are Targums? Yeah.
So the Targums are ancient Aramaic renderings of the Hebrew Bible, but they have in many ways different qualities from the typical translation. There is throughout a base translation of the biblical text, but often with these sort of removable expansions, if you will, that will surround the base translation. So they have this kind of combination of translation and commentary on the text. And of course, it varies from section to section and Targum to Targum. I decided to include them, even though many of them could be dated quite late, even into the medieval period, some of them as early as the 2nd century, perhaps. But in many cases, they are preserving very old exegetical traditions, and they're reading the Hebrew text. So that, for me, was the main criteria.
Yeah, that's great. Lots of interesting stuff we could talk about in Isaiah. If you have other things you'd like to discuss, feel free to add those in as well. But one that I think will be familiar to most of our viewers and listeners, and is of interest to me as a Markan guy too, is the opening of Isaiah 40. Prepare the
Yes.
way of Isaiah 43. Prepare the way of the Lord. And can you just talk to us a little bit about the Hebrew text there, and the different ways it can be, the different ways it gets taken up then in the tradition through translation, and how that affects the Gospels, but also the parallels we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well, because I think that's really interesting.
Yes. So in the Masoretic text for that quote in Isaiah 40, the parallelism of those phrases in the wilderness, in the desert plain, really requires you to read the phrase, in the wilderness with what follows, as opposed to describing the voice crying out. The Septuagint, however, and this is, one thing that sets apart the Septuagint of Isaiah from the Septuagint of the other three books. For the other three books, the translation technique is quite literal, and especially in the case of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, it puts you in a position to reconstruct a different Hebrew text in many cases. But for Isaiah, the translator essentially has something like what we have in the Masoretic text, but his technique is freer. And so in this particular case, the translator sees the second phrase, in the desert plain, as a bit redundant. So he doesn't reproduce it in his translation. And then this opens up a possibility then for the phrase in the wilderness. Now, this can be read either with what comes before or with what follows. And so that really plays into what Mark wants to introduce at the beginning of his gospel, that there's a voice crying in the wilderness.
Right.
And so it works quite well for that particular purpose. And of course, citation among the scrolls very much closely follows what you get in the MT. But I think just having that wiggle room there with the Septuagint is very helpful for what Mark wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it's required, right?
Mm-hmm.
It could be read either way in the
Mm-hmm.
Greek version,
Mm-hmm.
but it makes that a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And in the Dead Sea Scroll example, how are they responding to the text? So how are they understanding? If Mark is seeing the wilderness as the location where the announcement takes place, that's where the Baptist is doing his work. The Dead Sea Scroll example is they're also going out to the wilderness, but they're not the ones crying out.
Right.
They're responding to the call, right?
Right. So this is from the Rule of the Community in Cave 1. They interpret this to be the study of the law, which he commanded through the hand of Moses in order to act in compliance with all that has been revealed from age to age and in accordance with what the prophets have revealed through his Holy Spirit. So the comment that I make here does not explain the text to explain or quote the text to explain the voice of an individual, but rather as the basis for the separation of the community from the dwelling of sinful men to the desert in order to prepare the way of the Lord. This preparation is defined in terms of study of the Torah of Moses in order to act according to all that is revealed in it and according to what the prophets have revealed. So I do come back to this a little bit later when I talk about the conclusion of the prophets and the expectation of the forerunner prophet like Elijah, where you're getting some of that same language from Isaiah 40. In both cases, the reader is urged to prepare for the future work of God to be done through these two prophets by devoting himself or herself to the study of the Torah. So the end of this, I suggest, is actually somewhat similar to what the Rule of Community is suggesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Their community is obviously breaking off from what's going on in Jerusalem to devote themselves to this task. But there is a general call to sort of devote oneself to the reading of the Torah in expectation of a future work of God. Forerunner prophet like Elijah, and then a sort of messianic prophet like Moses.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting parallel to the Gospels that we have there.
Yes.
Where there's common interest in this text, different kind of understanding in terms of the activity that's being involved with the Baptist, calling people to kind of a general call to repentance and through the act of baptism in the river versus kind of pulling away from the larger group to live separately and study scripture in these little communities or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah. All right. What about with Jeremiah? I mean, I think the one thing that will be maybe surprising to some folks who maybe aren't as aware, with Jeremiah, we have kind of two distinct versions of the book. And so that presents a little bit of an interesting thing. It's not the only book that's the case, but it's probably the most pronounced in terms of the difference between what we thought was just Septuagint and MT, but then with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we learned, there's the Forlaga, the pretext of the LXX was in fact its own, Hebrew text, and so there's not some kind of weird abbreviated version going on with the Greek. So yeah, what do you do with that to begin with? And
yes.
Yeah, how do you fit that into the whole project?
Well, you're right. For a long time, these differences were recognized but attributed to the translator. And nowadays, there are a few folks who still are arguing for that,
Hmm.
but they are few and far between. Most have recognized, number one, because of the translation technique of Greek Jeremiah, which is very faithful to its source. So the expectation is that when you get these divergences from the MT, the translator didn't just decide to go crazy all of a sudden.
Hmm.
And then, secondly, as you mentioned, we now have fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls that agree at key points in main characteristics such as shortness and arrangement. And so it just sort of confirms the suspicion that there is a different Hebrew source there. It's a shorter source, it's a differently arranged source, so it has the material on the nations in the middle of the book instead of
Hmm.
at the end. And I've suggested in a number of places that there's also a fundamental difference in the theological message of the book, particularly as it pertains to Jeremiah's prophecy about the enemy from the north and the prophecy of 70 years and the way those texts are read by Ezekiel and Daniel. So for me, it's a fascinating piece of early interpretation because you've got a first edition of the book, which is behind our Greek Jeremiah, and then a second edition of the book. So that it's been systematically revised now with a new layer of editorial and exegetical editions. And that's what we have in our traditional text, the Masoretic text. Most of our English translations are translating that text. But there's a lot of interpretation going on
Yeah.
in the second edition, identifying the enemy from the north as Babylon, identifying the 70 years as a literal period of Babylonian captivity. And so it's interesting to think about, okay, that's one interpretation. And then are there other interpretations of that first edition, such as what we find in Ezekiel or Daniel, that take us in a different direction?
Mm.
So that, to me, was a really great way at getting at some of the earliest interpretation already in the transmission of the text and in the
Hmm.
editing of the text that was going on early.
Yeah, that's great. What do you do? I mean, I'm sure you've had students ask this question before, like, because we often think about like the Bible getting back to the original or whatever that
Right.
is. So when students ask you, "Hey, Dr. Shepard, should we use the earlier version or the later version?" What do you say?
Yes, that question comes up every semester.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
about 4 or 5 questions in the classes that I teach that I know are going to come
yeah.
within about a month of the beginning of the
You can just
class.
count on it, right? Yeah, yeah.
And that's definitely one of them. And we talk about that it's probably not going to suffice, especially if we're in the context of our local churches, just to stand up and say, hey, we've got 2 of these things, and now let's go on our merry way.
Hmm.
Um, that we would have to have some kind of discussion about the relationship between the two. So if we want to use the language of original or earlier or first, the evidence is in favor of the text behind Greek Jeremiah.
Hmm.
Now, that makes people nervous because that's not the one we're accustomed to reading.
Hmm.
And so I tried to give them a sense of where we have access to this text. We can look at English translations of the Septuagint. The New English translation of the Septuagint is great because you can access it for free online. My commentary on Jeremiah provides an English translation of the reconstructed Hebrew text behind Greek Jeremiah.
Oh, that's great.
And it's bracketed with all of the additions and changes in the Masoretic text. So you can compare them very easily. And the commentary is designed to sort of explain what's going on there. So try to show them, the value of that first edition, but this is not then to come along and throw out the MT.
Right.
That there is also value to the MT, even if certain of its interpretations we might disagree with. There are other interpretations that we would say, hey, that's a good way to go. I gave a presentation in the spring where I talked about the different ways of citing scripture in Jeremiah in the two editions. And very often, where there's a citation in the first edition, the second edition will come along and make it more explicit.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So it kind of makes
Yeah.
sure the reader doesn't miss, oh, there's a connection here that we need
Yeah.
to see.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
so I like them to value both of them, maybe for different reasons. Um, and students will often ask, well, do you think one day the ESV, NIV, whatever will do the first edition? I said, well, probably not. But I give them the illustration of what happened with the New Testament. At the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, after hundreds of years of having the Textus Receptus, suddenly there's this other text that becomes the standard text.
Having the brackets around certain parts now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is a kind of precedent for
Yeah.
that kind of a major shift toward a
Yeah.
different text.
Yeah, that's interesting. As you were talking to, I was wondering, I wonder if they could do something like they do in the Septuagint versions with Daniel, where they have the two
Right.
versions, the Theodotion and the LXX side by side. That would be kind of an interesting concept too to
That
do.
has been
Sure.
suggested. I think um, I've heard him say it different ways, but I know Emmanuel Tove always suggests, well, just translate the MT. But I think he's also said, with more critical editions, why not just put everything in parallel columns?
Yeah.
And you can see that together.
Yeah, it'd be interesting for study purposes, for people doing English study Bibles. That's kind of cool. All right. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for indulging that question, because I'm sure that is going to be in at least some people's minds when they're hearing us talk about this.
Yes.
Like, okay, well, what do we do with that? So you use the language of new covenant fairly consistently throughout the book, but Jeremiah is of course the new covenant prophet who specifically uses that language.
Right.
Could you talk to us a little bit about what he's doing with new covenant and maybe the different ways that it's taken up? So we can see within the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, an attempt to see a renewal of the Mosaic covenant as an interpretation of the Jeremiah text.
Yes.
And then we have the new covenant language showing up in the New Testament. And I think you're suggesting that they're both interpretations of the same idea, but they're going in different directions.
Yes. So you're right. The term New Covenant itself is unique through Jeremiah 31. The other prophets will talk about another covenant that is beyond the breaking of the old covenant, but they won't use that particular term.
Right.
So the interpretation that shows up among the scrolls for Jeremiah 31 is that, well, first of all, that they view themselves as this new covenant community. And secondly, that they see it as a renewal of what we think of as the Old Covenant or the Sinai Covenant or the Mosaic Covenant, which is an interesting interpretation since, Jeremiah 31 itself simply uses that adjective hadash, new, which doesn't really have the connotation of renewal. There is a perfectly good way of talking about renewal in biblical Hebrew. So we read about the renewal of Saul's kingship, uses a PL form of that particular root. But that form doesn't show up in Jeremiah 31. In fact, the only place or the first place that we get the language of renewing a covenant is in those early Dead Sea Scroll interpretations of Jeremiah 31. So then we come to places like Hebrews 8, where we're getting citation of Jeremiah 31 in the Septuagint form, no less, and does not use the language of renewing the Old Covenant. but this language of now the old covenant is obsolete, and the new covenant is a genuinely different thing.
Mm-hmm.
Which, in my opinion, is more consistent with what's going on there in Jeremiah's text. But it's interesting to see how two interpretive communities at the same time are taking up this passage, applying it to themselves, but it's a very different way of talking about its language.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things you pointed out, which I think is really important, is that how you parse new versus renewed kind of comes down to what you think the content of the new
Yes,
involves, right? So the idea of the new is that it's not an abrogation of the Torah, but that the Torah gets written on the law of the. So it's a recognition that the problem with the Mosaic covenant wasn't the Torah, but that
right.
the people didn't have the necessary equipment to fully keep the Torah, and so now the Spirit writes the Torah on their hearts.
Yes,
So there's continuity of Torah in that sense.
that's right.
Um, yeah, so you can talk maybe a little bit about that, because I think that's an important point.
I think it is where most of the discussion centers. Is this simply a different administration of the same covenant, or um, does this new feature of writing it on the heart make it a fundamentally different thing, even
Mm-hmm.
though
Mm-hmm.
Torah remains the same?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just on the tablets; it's now on the heart, so to speak. Um, where I've tended to focus is though just the strictly grammatical and semantic idea of hadash,
Mm-hmm.
that we can say renew.
Mm-hmm.
That is a feature of the language, and he doesn't use that.
Sure.
So for me, that's a very compelling piece, because now it's not left open to, what theological camp do I belong to, but rather there's this kind of hard grammatical data that I have to accept.
Yeah. So your point is more of just trying to follow as faithfully as possible the language that Jeremiah actually uses.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But your point is a very good one, that we're not saying Torah goes away, or that we've moved on to some other
Yeah.
revelation, but rather now the human heart itself is transformed, as opposed to being called to do something it simply cannot do.
Yeah. 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 And I like the Hebrews example is really interesting, because if you walk through that sermon,
Yes,
um, it doesn't really spell out all of what being it's not like a programmatic exposition of how the new covenant is different from the old covenant, except for the fact that the writer is very much interested in this new sacrificial cult, according to Melchizedek, a heavenly worship space. Um, but recognizing that you have access to that greater reality doesn't undermine the value of the Torah, because the
that's
writer
right.
throughout Hebrews takes the Torah very seriously. These laws of ritual washing, he says, they purify your flesh, which is what Leviticus says. And um, he says Moses never says anything about someone from the tribe of Judah serving as a priest in the earthly tabernacle. So it seems to take that very seriously that the Pentateuch doesn't mention that. So
Yes, well, and
it's,
even this, the Torah more broadly conceived as Hebrew Bible, is very
yeah,
important for him. The way he prefaces Hebrews with saying, okay, on the one hand we have this from the prophets, on the other hand this revelation in the Son, but the Son is no longer with us, right,
mm-hmm.
in his earthly ministry. So where does he go to explain it? He goes back
Scripture.
to all of these texts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. That's right. That's great. Okay, let's jump over to Ezekiel then. Lots of interesting stuff here, but I think one that really jumps out, and this is something you hear about all the time, and in fact, people may have encountered it because it can be a hot button topic even on like social media, Bible content, creation, because it's this really odd passage in Ezekiel where the prophet talks about God giving the people laws that were not good or statutes that were
Oh,
not
right.
good.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd love to hear kind of how you handle that. The references, at least the one that I jotted down, was Ezekiel 20:25. I'm not sure if there's multiple instances in the prophet where he says this. But the very next verse, if I'm not mistaken, mentions the offering. It mentions human sacrifice.
Yeah,
And
sort of an
so,
example of
as an
what.
example of these not good statutes. And so one very, I think, common, maybe it's the mainline interpretation, I don't know, you can correct me, but that Ezekiel is combating something that he sees in earlier in the tradition, where the offering of human beings seems to be something that was authorized, or at least that's one way that it's sometimes explained
Right.
in critical scholarship. So
Hmm.
yeah, could you walk us through that whole issue and why a prophet is talking about God giving laws that were not actually good laws?
It definitely is unique to that verse and has a really effective way of getting the reader's attention, because we would not expect to hear that even just in isolation. But certainly in the lead up to that verse in Ezekiel 20, it comes as a shock. Because Ezekiel 20 has this very sort of patterned presentation of the biblical narrative, where it's talking about at each stage, even starting in Egypt, that the people did not heed God's voice, but then he acted for the sake of his name, and they move on to the next stage. And three times in that rehearsal of the biblical narrative, you're getting the citation from Leviticus about
Mm-hmm.
if someone does these things, he will live by them.
Right.
So that
19:5, I believe. Is that right?
18.
18:5, excuse me. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's sort of ringing in your ears when you come to Ezekiel 20:25 that he has given them these statutes and judgments by which they can live. And of course, the whole discussion there is what exactly is meant by the life.
Mm-hmm.
Is he talking about you will have a blessed life? Is he talking about you will have eternal life? So I talk a little bit about early interpretations, including Targum Onkelos, that take that in the sense of eternal life.
Mm-hmm.
So you come to Ezekiel 20:25, and suddenly he turns that on its head. And he gave them no good laws by which they could not live. So a lot of interpreters, both ancient and modern, including the Targum there, I think in the book I mentioned Dan Block's commentary. It's sort of unacceptable that this would say the laws themselves are somehow no good. Block's suggestion is that this is a reference back to the statutes and judgments of their forefathers, mentioned a little bit earlier in the passage. It's a very sort of fine detail that he hones in on. Normally, the term for statutes in this passage is hukot, so the feminine plural. But here it's using the masculine plural, which matches the earlier usage where it talks about the statutes of the forefathers. So he thinks, well, maybe this is talking about the practices of their forefathers, which were wayward. And so now the present generation has fallen into this same problem.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't quite get us around the fact that it said these were things that God gave them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I point out in the book that actually there's very little difference in usage between the masculine plural and feminine plural of that term. And I don't think ultimately that's the way we want to go with it. I think what he's getting at there is this idea that the offer of life through the keeping of these statutes and judgments was only and always a hypothetical offer.
Mm-hmm.
It was the sort of thing that was designed to expose their need for the kind of new covenant relationship that Jeremiah ultimately talks about.
Mm.
So I sometimes in classes I use the illustration of an impossible assignment.
Hmm.
I say, okay, I'm going to send you all home, and you're going to have to read the entire Hebrew Bible for class tomorrow, and you'll have to video yourself doing it. And I said, well, the only point of making that assignment would be to show that you cannot do it. So the idea here with Ezekiel is to say, look, I gave you these statutes and law by which hypothetically you could live, but ultimately they only expose the fact that you cannot obtain life by it. And this is illustrated by the fact that they take his good laws and pervert them into things like child sacrifice.
Mm.
So the point then would be very similar to Paul's in Romans 7, that the laws themselves are not bad.
Hmm.
What's no good about them is that they are ineffective to the human heart and ultimately need to be written on the heart in order to see the fruit.
Yeah. So is Ezekiel's rhetorical point then in your reading, Ezekiel's rhetorical point is that if we look at our collective story, we can see that it all kind of led us nationally or collectively to this death. God gave us these laws of life, but in fact, it was inevitable that we would break them, that we would die, and that we would need to, thinking Ezekiel 37, we would need to rise then and
Right.
enter into this new relationship.
And
Uh,
essentially the same points, going back to the Song of Moses, that
mhm.
whole song is prefaced at the end of Deuteronomy 31
Yeah,
with this expectation that in the last days you guys are just going to go awry. And here's the song that kind of tells the story of each stage of your history.
right, right. So he's working in that same kind of trajectory. That makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it does work in many ways really well. I mean, I guess from a New Testament perspective, would you argue that does Paul think that Jesus uniquely is the one who is able, born under the law, able to live in a way that is in full obedience to the law, and so then obtain eternal life, which others can share in? Or is he taking like a different path, so to speak?
Yeah, I think he comes not so much to do what we couldn't do, but to redeem us from the consequences of what we couldn't do.
Yeah.
I think it's taken for granted that he comes as
Mhm.
one who's obedient to the Father. That doesn't necessarily have to be demonstrated, but he comes as one to redeem. It's an interesting discussion that still goes on about is he new Israel? Is he coming to be the version that they weren't? I see him more as coming in, not to sort of rewrite the story that they've written, but rather to come in and redeem them precisely because of the way they wrote the story.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one aspect of the tradition that is just very ubiquitous, and it's hard to miss that throughout being the people of God, being Israel, is recognizing that we haven't lived up to our end of the bargain. We've fallen. We need God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's act to redeem us. That's through the Torah. That's through the prophets. So it's a consistent feature throughout. And I think sometimes when people get to the New Testament and they see Jewish followers of Jesus and Jesus himself making that point, we're so trained to think in our Christian brain, oh, here's a one religion critiquing another religion or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
When in fact they're just doing the same thing that you see Moses doing, that you see the prophets doing. They're having that very conversation
Right,
um,
right.
right before our eyes in the text. So,
Hmm.
okay, so the Book of the 12. I think,
I should mention
yeah,
before we
please.
leave Ezekiel, since we brought this up with Jeremiah, that Ezekiel has a similar thing going on with MT and Septuagint.
Yeah.
the Hebrew text behind the Greek there is also quite a bit shorter than what we have in the MT. So a lot of interpretive expansions being introduced in that second edition. It's not quite to the same extent, but there are quite a few rearrangements as well. So it's something that I touch on at various points.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Book of the 12. Real quick, just real quick rundown of what we're talking about there. So people sometimes maybe use the phrase minor prophets. I think that was Augustine, I believe, who introduced that phrase into the tradition. I could be wrong
Yes.
about that. But yeah, that this is actually these prophetic books, which we're trained to kind of think of as individual books, that in antiquity they were primarily understood as a single composition, and that when we look at them, it's quite clear that the writers are working to connect these texts together, so that when you get them all together as one, there's just an incredible amount of lexical and thematical links running throughout them, so you read them as this one thing.
Yes. I should mention there are many different views about the 12 among scholars. There's been a real interest in thinking about Hosea through Malachi since James Nagalski published his work in the early 90s on the redactional processes that went into this. Not everybody has bought in to the idea that these have come together as some sort of intentional composition. Most will recognize that they were transmitted together in antiquity because the evidence is really overwhelming for that. But why they were transmitted together and how they were received as a transmitted collection does continue to differ.
Sure. So, for example, it could be more of an act of convenience that you fit these all on one scroll versus some sort of larger theological project or something like that. Yeah.
So you will still have people working in the field that will insist, no, when we do a commentary on Hosea, for example, it should just be on Hosea and that's it.
Right.
Where the other would say, no, we should probably put these all together. There are some who will take a kind of middle ground and say, well, I'm not so sure about the intentionality behind the transmitting of these together, but maybe we should at least think about the effect of it and are there overarching themes. But the folks that are working either on redactional processes or larger macrostructural composition, they're the ones that are really talking about somebody meant to do this, and we actually have signs of their activity within the text that we can trace. And that's sort of more of the camp that I would fit myself into. So with having said that, what you're referencing is the idea that if they were shaped this way, and if they were received to be read with that larger context in view, that does inform the way the texts are picked up and interpreted. So one of the examples that I give in the book is the Habakkuk Pesher from the Qumran scrolls. And of course, this is one of our most extensive early commentaries on the first two chapters, essentially giving us a short text citation and then commentary and just sort of alternating back and forth between the two in those two chapters. One of the interesting features of that commentary is, and it's true of other Pesher commentaries such as the one on Nahum, is this interpretation of the book as an eschatological book.
Yeah, they think every line basically applies to their present moment and talking.
Well,
yeah,
I want to distinguish between interpreting as an eschatological book on the one hand and applying it to their time on the other hand. So I want to keep those two things separate. I think receiving Habakkuk as an eschatological book is an interesting thing to consider
Mm-hmm.
given its location within the 12 and what's going on in the rest of the book of the 12 concerning the last days. So I think there's something legitimate about that interpretation of Habakkuk. The idea then that the last days were happening there with the Qumran community in the first century, I consider a separate issue.
Sure. No, fair
That,
enough. Yeah, 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 yeah,
that would
yeah,
be interpretation and then application, right?
yeah,
To
yeah,
their
for sure,
particular
for sure.
situation.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes
Well, and they're
when
not far off. I mean, if we're going to go with Peter, the last days,
that's right,
Pentecost. I mean, it's not
yeah,
that far off, you
kind of
know.
an inaugurated version of it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
um, but the I think sometimes folks read that feature of the Pesher commentaries and it leads them to be immediately dismissive of them.
Yeah.
Oh, well, they're just, talking about what they think about themselves. And so that's not really helpful.
You'd get an F in your hermeneutics class if
Right.
you went
Yeah.
through line by line in the Bible and
Yeah.
said, yeah, when Habakkuk said this, he was talking about this Tuesday. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
sure,
Yeah.
sure, sure,
So
sure.
I think in order for readers to see, actually, there may be something there that shows an awareness of that larger composition of the 12 that could be actually quite helpful.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things you focused on was this very phrase, the end of days.
Yes.
Can you walk us through that a little bit and how that kind of ties together the 12?
Yes. So in my commentary on the 12, I talk about Hosea 3, 4 and 5 as a kind of programmatic text for the composition of the 12. Talks about coming judgment, and then beyond that judgment, this phrase, in the end of days, the people will seek God. They will seek David, their king,
Mm-hmm.
or the Davidic Messiah. And this is a phrase in the Hebrew Bible that's used quite sparingly, but also very strategically. So it shows up with the major poems of the Pentateuch. It's right there at the beginning of Isaiah 2. So it's really at these strategic locations, in each case talking about this kind of future work of God and the coming of an ideal king. And so that really sets the trajectory for the 12, and the compositional scenes that then connect the individual books are all developing that program in some way.
Mm.
So it has this kind of top-down effect on the reader, that there's this macro structure in place that's informing how you're reading these lower levels. And you're kind of receiving it as the composer is kind of giving these texts a life beyond
Mm.
the immediate historical context of the individual prophet.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really good. And of course, we see this get taken up in the New Testament as
Mhm.
well. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think you mentioned Peter's sermon, if I'm not mistaken. And what's interesting there is he's quoting from the prophet Joel. The
Mhm.
only part of the text that's not that's being inserted. I don't think there's any evidence that it's part of a textual tradition. Is that word "in the last days,"
Right.
which he
Yes,
begins with, but it makes sense thematically if he's thinking along the lines of the
that's right.
12. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very good. Um, okay, maybe last thing we could touch on, and then if there's anything else you'd like to discuss, but the last chapter, um, where you're focusing on prophecy as a kind of, I guess, exegetical process and the transition. We've seen this discussion in other places as well, the kind of transition from prophet, so to speak, the oral event to prophet as scribe or something like that.
Right.
You take us through that a little bit and just kind of what you're particularly interested in that conversation.
Yes. So last 30 years or so, there's been an overwhelming abundance of new scholarship on ancient scribes and scribal practices and training and what was that like, and what can we learn from that in terms of the making of the Bible and so forth. And I really wanted to tie this into what I've been tracing in the book, and that is this textual interpretation. and that this interpretation has really been the driving force behind the generation of these prophetic books and then their subsequent reception. So, one of the things that you'll see in the literature is this tracing of a kind of redefinition of what a prophet was, even within the Bible itself. So, as you mentioned, we often think of prophets as preachers that are delivering messages orally to the people. And we had a whole stage of scholarship that was devoted to reconstructing that in the 19th and 20th century. But now there's been a shift toward focusing on this other kind of prophet. So already within the Bible, we've got prophets like Zechariah quoting from Jeremiah, and this is going into the building of his book. So the prophet is being redesigned as somebody who reads and interprets prophetic texts. And this becomes a tradition that gets picked up in the kind of scribal tradition that you see in places like the NT's interpretation of the first edition of Jeremiah. So I wanted to show that kind of shift. It's something that continues in post-biblical interpretation. I give examples from Septuagint and Targum, where you're getting prophets called scribes, and scribes are called prophets, and, and there's kind of this interchangeable way of viewing them, so that I think our reception of these texts should be informed by that. I talk a little bit about the sort of formation of a prophetic corpus, and then its reception within the larger canon, and then even within some of the New Testament writings, the question of what do we mean in those writings when we're talking about prophets. Sometimes you have a prophet like Agabus who looks like a prophet of old. And then you have other texts like 1 Corinthians 14 and other places seem to be talking about prophecy as a kind of teaching, and a term that's used alongside words that talk about encouraging the people and exhorting the people and teaching the people, as if we're talking about precisely this type of prophet who reads and interprets prophetic scriptures. So for me, it was a nice kind of final chapter to reflect on this whole phenomenon of the textualization of prophecy and how interpretation has really been the driving force behind that.
Yeah, that's great. And as the larger implication, maybe we can kind of close with this. As the larger implication for that from your book, are you hoping that when people are thinking about the text, that's making the text itself the focus rather
Yes.
than some other other reconstructed scenario kind of thing?
Yeah, I think these things have a way of trickling down from scholarship to more popular formats. And certainly we had a long period where there was a focus on what was going on behind the text with these prophets. And that took its own kind of strange form in preaching of various kinds. So my hope is that now with this shift toward, focusing on composition and textual interpretation, that will also find its way into an accessible format in our churches, and people kind of retrain to think about, oh, this is an object of study in its own right. And I'm not just using that as a window into something else.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that might involve a little bit of a paradigm shift for some people in the pews, because I think sometimes, you see these cool graphs showing like all the ways that the Bible's interconnected. And of course, some of those are maybe in the eye of the beholder, but a lot of it is true. It's an interconnected network of texts. And sometimes people point to that as kind of being like this miraculous thing. It just fell out of the sky this way. But what you're pointing out is, no, it's a result of faithful followers of God making these connections as the tradition grows to help the readers then see them
Yes.
in that process.
Yes, certainly with the interpretation that's taking place in the Bible itself. Um, you know, we talk about these authors writing in their own style and in the conventions of their time, but that includes the interpretive process as well, and to
Yeah.
think about that as being superintended by the Spirit as opposed to independently of these authors. Somehow it's
Yes.
coming out this way. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I've noticed that just a necessary shift for some students to recognize that just as an author could be inspired, a redactor or an additional composer could also be inspired in the same way. Like we just have to have a broader understanding of inspiration than sometimes is allowed for.
And I think another shift that it can almost be a kind of sleight of hand sometimes in our teaching and preaching in our churches, where there's a kind of quick move from what the text is talking about to what we might imagine is the event or message behind that. And so we kind of move over there and become independent interpreters of that, as
Oh,
opposed
interesting. Yeah.
as opposed to, oh, there's already an interpretation of it over here, but we
hmm
had to be following rules of grammar and syntax and so forth to figure out what's going on with it.
Yeah. Let's be text based. I like that very much. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Shepard. Anything else you'd like to share before we conclude?
Well, I think we covered it pretty well. You've
Yeah.
I'm glad you got to read the book and spend some time with it. It certainly
Yeah.
makes the conversation very enjoyable.
Yeah, it was great for me. I mean, as I said, I enjoyed it a lot. Very interested in this subject. I'm currently working on a book with a colleague on Mark's interpretation of Scripture. So
Okay.
it's very much up, the alley. And your book, the text in between, has been a really helpful resource for me. As
Oh,
well.
great.
Yeah. So encourage everybody to go out and get this book. One of the things I didn't mention, but it is, and I'll talk about it in the intro, or people have already seen it, but it's not a big read either. He's
That's
done a
right.
really great job of making it accessible and making it manageable. So, fantastic. Thanks so much, Dr. Shepard.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. Yeah.
I appreciate
Awesome.
it.
Thanks. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.